This is the legend of a woman named Magdalena. Born in Katowice, Poland, Magdalena found great joy in the performance of piano. From a young age, piano would define her career path. Finding great joy in each piano lesson, Magdalena would find herself growing year after year in her musical prowess. Soon, she would perform at the great concert halls around the continent, developing her own musical style in the process. Magdalena was happy. And then something virtuosic would happen that would change her life forever. You see, this change didn't really happen in one day. Rather, it was a gradual development of herself that made her a legend. In 2014, Magdalena would be appointed as director of the music performance program at Columbia-University, and would even become the director of the joint Columbia-Juilliard music performance program, which is one of the world's most elite music performance programs. Throughout her entire career as a Yamaha artist, she has performed with the world's most renowned orchestras, such as the San Francisco Symphony Orchestra, the Philadelphia Orchestra, and the China National Symphony. She has also collaborated with Oscar and Grammy Award-winning artists such as Joshua Bell, Charles C. Fox, and Tan Dun, performing at concert halls such as the Guangzhou Opera House, the Beijing National Center for the Performing Arts, Davies Symphony Hall, and Philadelphia Kimmel Center. Magdalena has also taught masterclasses at the Manhattan School of Music, the Beijing Central Conservatory, New York University, International Keyboard Institute, Hong Kong Academy for the Performing Arts, and the Xi'an Conservatory. Magdalena has become both a virtuosic performer and an academic musical powerhouse. And to top it all off, Magdalena was a judge at the 2025 Canadian Chopin Competition. She is described by ConcertoNet as Columbia University professor by day, musical sorceress by night. But here, she is known as a legend. This is the legend of Magdalena Baczewska. Magdalena, thank you so much for coming on to the show.
Thank you so much, Amos. It's wonderful to be here and hearing hearing the introduction read with your voice definitely makes me feel like a legend.
Thank you. Thank you. So we first met at the Canadian Chopin Competition. And as I mentioned, you were one of the judges of the competition, and I was one of the MC/hosts/announcers of the competition. And this episode being recorded at the beginning of April, it really goes to show just how fast time just flies since January. It almost felt like yesterday, honestly, at this point still.
Indeed it does, yes. It was a wonderful beginning of the year to start off hearing so many wonderful young musicians play Chopin on such high level. So it was already a very high note way in early January.
Yeah, totally agree. So let's start off from the very beginning. What inspired you to pursue piano?
Oh dear. I don't really have the greatest answer for that because both my parents are musicians, now retired, and music was always a part of my life. And, I would find my way to the piano after the daily cartoon was over because, in communist Poland, you didn't have a Cartoon Network. There was 10 minutes of cartoons from 7 to 7:10. And then right before bedtime, I would run over to my mom's piano and try to figure out how those tunes went. And so I suppose that was the moment when they may have realized, she may be musical. And I always sang with my mom. She really made sure to keep the music, accessible to me. But most importantly, I heard her practice. Whenever I was taking my little naps or playing in my room, she would practice, her repertoire, like the Franck sonata or the Brahms, viola or clarinet sonatas, or the various trio repertoire. And this was just something that I took for granted. This became kind of the soundtrack of my childhood, only to realize later that not every kid had that opportunity at home. So music sort of rolled into my life very seamlessly. Then my sisters were born, and they are twins. So you can only imagine going from a single child to all of a sudden having to be the older sister, the wiser and, the more understanding older sister, to twins. All the attention that my parents were giving me all of a sudden went to these two creatures. And so my parents decided at some point that it would probably be useful to get me busy with something. And that's how I started piano lessons. My sisters are just fine. We survived. We love each other very much. We text every single day, and they actually both became professional musicians as well, playing in orchestras in Poland and Spain. So that's how music came into our lives.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And to grow up with younger twin sisters, that's absolutely that's certainly a life to certainly a very exhilarating time, childhood and adolescence as well, I could imagine.
It was an interesting dynamic because there were always two of them, and so they had the power in numbers over me. But I have such fond memories of those afternoons when we were all practicing at the same time. My mom was on the baby grand, and I was there on the upright, or we would switch. And then my sisters were playing their violins. One later switched to viola, and they were very passionate about the orchestra. Homework, so they would often play together, and you would only hear the violin parts of, let's say, the Egmont Overture of Beethoven, and but it was just so extremely endearing, to hear them play that with, a counterpoint with what my mom was doing, and then what I was doing, and there was my father also, who was a professional singer in a professional chorus, so. It really sounded like a conservatory in our apartment. Neighbors weren't as crazy about it as one could imagine, but we had a great time. And to this day, when I walk down a hallway of a conservatory, I have this very lovely feeling that brings me, back home.
Yeah. My mom was my first piano teacher as well. She taught me up all the way until my high school years, and then I moved on to a different teacher as well. But yeah, I can relate to that because of, from a young age, being put into piano. Actually, I enjoyed learning piano right off the bat. Actually, I started learning when I was 3. So for me, I totally relate to having been born into a very musical environment, because if I'm not the one playing the piano at home, my mom's piano students would be the ones playing piano at home as well. So
there's always plenty of piano repertoire that you would hear, and it's so interesting that your brain starts absorbing it, and then when you sit down to learn the piece yourself, you realize that you really know it quite well already, right? It's just a matter of putting it in your fingers. Yeah. Well, your mom was very brave. Mine decided to hire a piano teacher for me, because she had a feeling that I would not listen to her, and maybe she was right. So I had an angel of a piano teacher, and they always say that the teacher can make or break a student, and I really believe that first memory of a formal piano lesson was something that made me decide, okay, this is what I would like to continue doing. And my teacher is turning 95 in May. She's around, and bless her, she's in love, great spirits, and I just love talking to her on the phone. So she's back in Poland, and I see her when I go back. But that first memory of her teaching me by ear to play a little song on black keys is something that I still remember all these years later, and just trying to prepare and being and to be on top of my assignment, and even maybe above and beyond my assignment, trying to learn that same song on white keys to make her happy the next time, was just something that I remember being very passionate about, and her encouragement, her kindness really were the driving force in that journey.
Yeah, and I can imagine that that would have been very influential on you, not just as a pianist from a learning perspective, but also from a musical stylistic perspective as well, with this constant exposure to music at home and with your piano teacher as well. I think this would have been, along with other influences, very, very, well, influential on your life as a pianist.
Oh, certainly, yes. And, just as I mentioned at the beginning, it only occurred to me when I formally went to school with other kids that not everybody has a musical encyclopedia in their home library, or, as your mother is making you eggs in the morning, not everybody could just ask, Mom, what is animato, for example, and then she would just respond there while she's flipping omelets, and so it was an incredibly lucky situation to be in, just to be able to have these musical conversations about, voice leading and improvisation and cadenzas and stuff like that. Was just really precious, and something that I learned not to take for granted.
Yeah, and that's something that I've noted, that I was born and raised in Canada, a Western country, and Canada, unlike Poland, and for that matter, most of Europe, is not necessarily a country that really focuses on the development of classical music from a young age, at a cultural level at least. So for me, I had a similar experience where it was my mom was my piano teacher, so I could ask her like you did, with questions about different pieces of music and terminology, and also theory as well. But it's even rarer here in Canada, because even the culture for it is very, very minimal, if not existent at all, even at times. So I think that I totally relate to the fact that you realize that this is not very common at all, because it's even rarer here in Canada. And if anything, sometimes people will be like, they look at you as if you were from Mars. It's like, wait, what are you even talking about?
Yes, yeah. So you would have been one of these kids who I just admire, and I still don't know where all this, wherewithal and all this will to make music on such high level comes from. Because yes, like you said, in the communist countries, there were many problems with living under that regime. But one thing was amazing, which was you could just go for free to a state school where you would specialize in music from the first grade, and we had ear training and whatnot, history of music from really young age. So I had that structure right away. The sciences and all the other classes maybe suffered because the ratio was very different. But I knew my voice leading in fourth grade, my solfege. When I came to the U.S. to study, I was shocked that not everybody spoke solfege, so to say. And so yeah, when you share your story, or when I hear the young contestants of the Toronto competition, I'm thinking, how do they do that? Going to regular school, they have to be held by their parents to a piano lesson, let alone any kind of extra education, such as harmony, counterpoint, right, music theory. That is certainly not obvious, right, in Western culture, in the U.S. and Canada.
Yeah. And so I'm of ethnic Chinese descent. So I can say from the Chinese perspective, and for that matter, from also most Asian perspectives as well, but I'll speak primarily from the Chinese perspective, given that I'm a part of the diaspora, music is our hockey. Piano is our hockey. So just as the Canadians, how they treat their Connor McDavids, their Tyler Seguins, or whoever their top players are, that they treat them with such an utter respect and reverence for, we do the same with piano, with with the Long Longs, with the Yu Zhou Wangs, with the Xiangjin Chous, with the Da Sol Kims or the Rubinsteins of the world, basically. So for us, piano very much defines our core being, at least from a social and a cultural perspective. So the devotion when it comes to music education, and I'm not even speaking from my own experience, because for me, I was lucky to have my mom as my piano teacher, but even for those who didn't have parents who were musically inclined, for them, it was expected. This was not negotiable. You learn music, piano mostly, but there's also violins, also very, very common. Actually, my cousin, Kirsten Young, who I also had in my podcast, he learned violin also as well, and it was also, non-negotiable, right? This is something that every ethnic Chinese kid, or most ethnic Chinese kids, did. So when it comes to that devotion towards music education, I think that's where it comes from, a deep cultural devotion towards the arts. And this, I think, goes back thousands of years, but in recent centuries, I think this is more devoted towards Western classical music, but the culture is still very much there.
Yes, and it's just a beautiful and admirable saying. I remember having an interaction with a student who was from China, and he came to me saying, Professor, I thought that I was learning piano just to get into college, to get into an Ivy League university, but now I realize I really love it, and I thought, well, thank goodness for your parents who dragged you probably to your lessons or, to practice. As you say, it was non-negotiable. And now you can finally start appreciating the fact that you have this amazing ability, right, to make something beautiful happen. And it's a figure that once blew my mind was that there were 40 million children in China learning piano at any given time. This is from a few years ago. And 40 million is the entire population of Poland. So
and Canada.
Here we go, right? So I just imagined every single person in my native Poland at the piano practicing right at that moment. So you're right, the musical culture and the kind of feeling of must, of non-negotiability of it is a beautiful thing. And I think it also teaches us so much about ourselves, about that whole journey, because it's not an easy journey, right? To be a concert pianist, it's a lot of the times people who live, kind of on the outside of that lifestyle, they may think, oh, it's so relaxing to play the piano, oh, studies show that if you play the piano, you feel that much more calm. Well, maybe not necessarily for concert musicians, right? Who do have to keep up their ability, their craft. They're kind of like athletes of the small muscles, right? You could say, right? You skip a day or, God forbid, 3 days of practice, you're in big trouble, right? So it's non-negotiable in that if you don't feel well, if you don't feel like it at all, you still have to do it, right? To stay on top of it. And that better be learned way early in childhood.
I mean, the old saying goes, you skip a day of practice, you notice it. You skip 2 days of practice, your friends notice it. You skip 3 days of practice, everybody notices, right?
That's right.
That old saying is so true. And music enforces structure and order, not just in terms of the performance, but also in terms of how we approach it, and also even in terms of how we live it, actually. So I think that that definitely requires discipline in the first place, but it requires a certain level of concentration and determination for it as well. Returning to the way we were talking about how there isn't really much of a culture in music, or in classical music, I should say, in Canada and the US, but I can say that in the province of Ontario, where I live, Ontario, Canada, actually for the last 9 or so years, public schools have actually been teaching music on carts, which basically means, which is not a good thing, because the teachers who teach them have no music training at all. So there were so many cuts in terms of some music departments in some schools are basically gone. So you're left with teachers who don't know solfege at all, who are trying to teach music from a book that's on a cart. Like, how is that effective, right? So, I mean, you wouldn't teach math like that. You wouldn't teach English like that. You wouldn't teach science or chemistry, physics, or biology like that. So why approach it that way? But see, that's sort of an example of the problems that are faced here in Canada, and I think it's because they just don't have that prioritization of music and the arts as much as Europe or Asia does to that extent.
It's very unfortunate. It's also the case here in the US. And, the moment the economy is not the greatest, it's the libraries and it's the music programs that go. And because of that, I think that our responsibility as musicians really extends to sharing music with those generations who, as you say, in other countries would have maybe had that kind of instruction in kindergarten or school. So it's and these are the formative years, right? That's when your brain is absorbing like a sponge, and that's when you want to get the kids excited and exposed to the art form. I think there's a huge misconception. I even meet students at Columbia, and we could agree that it's an elite university, right? But I meet students who have never been to a classical concert in their lives, and it's only natural because they've never been exposed. So this, when I take them to the opera, for example, they say, "Professor, this was never on my bucket list," and honestly, I just thought it was for snobs. But this is great. I can't believe it. I actually even cried a little, and they are having a major discovery. So I do think that the early exposure really means a lot. And that said, it's never really too late to discover great music.
Yeah, totally agree. And I saw that even with the Canadian Chopin competition. So I invited a good number of my friends, close friends, to come watch, and almost all of them were athletes. So little to no exposure to classical music whatsoever. Or they do, but they kind of had to stop part way because they wanted to focus more on their athletic pursuits instead of their musical pursuits. And when they come here at the Canadian Chopin Competition, all of them told me, I never could have imagined that you could play piano not only to a high level, but to that level, to the extent where there are actually I'm not just hearing one good pianist, I'm hearing 30 to 40 good pianists, and they're all younger than me. Not by much, but younger than me, right? So it's like, whoa, this is how far it can go. There's an entire world that I didn't know of. And I told them, I'm like, you see, I told you you would not regret it, because, and this is an entire world, like, as you said, you've never seen before.
This is fascinating and so wonderful of you to invite them, and great of them to accept your invitation. But yes, it's true. And I have this observation as well with people sometimes who have, as you say, maybe done sports or, some, let's say, windsurfing, right? Even something for pleasure, but something that takes work, right? You have to perfect your jibes and so on. And they will come to a concert and say, whoa, this really, I don't know what's going on, but I can appreciate the effort, the concentration, right? The skill and the intensity, right? Because they almost feel the heat emanating from your body or the sweat coming down from people's foreheads. And that level of intensity, I think, even if you are not a musicologist, and if you're not trained to understand what happens in the piece, you can still appreciate kind of you have a visceral response to what's happening, right?
Yeah. And for them, the way how I, at least with my friends, the way how I introduced it with them and also with my colleagues was that because they're more sports inclined, I equated these competitions with sports analogies. So the International Chopin Competition, I constantly call it the Olympics of piano, because you win that competition, your life changes overnight and your career has just begun. Or the Canadian Chopin Competition, and really any national Chopin competition, is really the Olympic qualifiers. So you win that, you qualify for the Olympics, aka the International Chopin Competition. So that's how I explain it to them, and they're just like, "Wow, okay, now that totally makes sense," because now I'm hearing actually Canada's best pianists all in one place, all in one concert hall, playing across 4 days. So I think that being able to relate to them in a way that's not aggressive, but also not distant, in a way that they're able to connect. Oh, so this is equivalent to this. I think that's really effective in getting more people on board, at least in one way.
This is so great what you're saying. And you also, sitting there and listening to you introduce the players and their repertoire with your fabulous voice made it definitely sound like the Olympics. And I think it was such an important factor in that whole event that made it really feel like this we're witnessing a fierce, not only artistic but physical competition, and these are the kids who have come from all across this huge country to really do their best. And we know, watching sports, how sometimes you have perfected your act, and let's say your flight was delayed, right? You didn't sleep well, or you simply are not having a great day. Your breakfast didn't sit well, right? And all of a sudden, you all you have is those few minutes to do your best, right? And to convey. It's completely identical to what happens in sports, right? People travel thousands of miles to come and do that 8-second, run, and sometimes they choke, right? Even though they've done it, hundreds of times, all of a sudden the legs don't listen to them, right? And so same thing happens with our fingers, with our memory, and so yeah, it's kind of like almost like a blood sport in a way.
Yeah. Well, I thank you. First of all, I appreciate your kind words, and second of all, yeah, and as a sports announcer myself, I see direct parallels between sports and music, and that's why coming from essentially both of these worlds, I use that as much as I possibly can to explain it to people here in Canada, because again, that's how they can easily connect and relate to it, and for them, they can enjoy it also to a better extent, because it's not just this random snobby, egotistical, quote unquote, event. It's like, these kids are, if they went down a physical path, they would have been Olympic hopefuls at some point, right? So it's that sort of a connection and relationship between different ideas that I think really work with promoting events like the Chopin competition.
Yeah, you've done such a marvelous job of it. I just wish we could clone you so you could do it all over the place.
I should say though, I'm but one man. It's really the work of the Canadian Chopin Society that really brought it forward. The Canadian Chopin Competition would not have succeeded without the help of, first of all, Janet Lopinski, legendary in her own right. Konrad Swierczek, this is a name that isn't very mentioned a lot, but he was the brains and the brawn of the production. The live streams that people watched online, he was the guy who made that. A lot of the other logistics and parts, he was the one who spearheaded that. So really, really Konrad Swierczek and Janet Lopinski and the rest of the organizing committee as well should be the ones who are getting really the credit for this. I'm just but one man. I'm just the guy who has a big mouth. That's why.
They were also right in hiring you to do the job. They're absolute superstars, and the entire interaction just could not have been more delightful. And and Janet really attracting the students who really represent not only the best of pianism but also the best of pedagogy, music pedagogy in Canada. I was just so, I felt so delighted and just thrilled to hear that these kids are not only moving their fingers very, with great ability, they really were making music and communicating with the audience. And that was felt because you could hear the sound of the applause was slightly different for each contestant. They were all playing the same piano. It sounded like a different instrument under the various fingers, right? So I think that was also just such a privilege to hear. And I think, it was really Janet's great work in bringing all these folks together.
Yeah, totally agree. Totally agree. And for those of you in the audience who don't know, Dr. Janet Lopinski is a longtime senior member of the Royal Conservatory of Music. I believe she is the director of educational programs at the RCM. So, and also I think chief examiner emeritus at one point as well. So very much up there, up in the higher ups, and is a very important figure in bringing forward the, music education in Canada as a whole. So yeah, very, very much a legend in her own right, and very important for Canada's musical development. Returning to your career, and as you get older as a pianist, speaking about musical performance and style, how has your style of playing evolved from your early years to your current years?
Well, that's a great question, and I think you will get as many answers as there are pianists out there. But again, having had that musical background, I already had that advantage of being familiar with lots of repertoire, and I do think that in forming your own style, you have to really spend a lot of time also listening to music, and not just the pieces that you're currently working on, just to kind of compare and take notes. No, you have to have as full a picture as possible of not just the piano repertoire as a whole, but orchestral, especially vocal repertoire. I can never stress enough the importance of listening to great singers. You'll probably find me at the opera more often than, at the Philharmonic or at a piano recital, because that's where I'm really learning how to carry a phrase, how to breathe, right? And we all need that. It's very easy to rattle off difficult passages on the piano without breathing, but that's really something that we need just like anyone else. And the fact, that I really felt so passionate about teaching, and not only at the piano, but also in the classroom, teaching academic courses and exploring music from a bit more scholarly perspective, has also changed the way I play. This has maybe also affected the kind of repertoire I choose to play. I could never ever do what some of these kids at the competition were doing in terms of playing one muscular work after the next. I just don't have these kinds of chops. But the repertoire that really sits well with me, is Bach, for example, Chopin, and I've learned to accept that. I've learned to accept that I won't be giving a recital of complete Liszt Etudes. There are people who do it far better than I ever would, and we're so lucky as pianists. The repertoire is so vast, right? That we really can spend a lifetime working on just the pieces we truly love. And so, being able to look at some of these works from a scholarly perspective made me enjoy them even more. My doctoral dissertation was on the rhetorical aspects of Bach's instrumental music, for example. So when I play his, even short dance pieces, I just find a universe of knowledge to explore and layers to hear that I would not have ever imagined had I just learned them, as a pianist and maybe compared a few recordings. So I think my personal style, it sounds very grand, but what I do, as a pianist is really affected kind of by a summation of my experiences. I think that's really the case with everyone else. Some people have, again, amazing physical abilities, playing octaves for a long time, fortissimo. I never had that. So instead of trying to overcome it, I just find repertoire that fits with my physical being, knowing my limitations and finding my passions. I think that and again, just digging more and more deeply into the kind of the behind the scenes, the backgrounds, the influences of various composers. I think that I hope that it communicates through my playing, that there is this kind of a certain layer of knowledge that I can also communicate through the physical act of playing the piano. You are muted, Amos.
Yeah, and that is so great to hear because, well, let's first start off with your comments about how you're often at an opera more so than at a piano concert or at a philharmonic. That goes so well, especially with Romantic era repertoire, with the bel canto singing, right? So one of the best sources, if not the best source, is probably operatic singing, because, well, that's literally singing, and then you're getting inspiration from that, and you're bringing it into your own playing. That's such a great way of putting it. And when it comes to playing all these difficult pieces and as you mentioned, muscly piece after muscly piece, and you mentioned Liszt Etudes. When you mentioned that, I was thinking about Yunchan Lim, and when you played all Transcendental Etudes in one sitting at the Clyburn, I'm thinking, wait.
It was a superhuman thing to do. And he did it so beautifully, too. It was not just impressive, it was so moving, right? So touching.
Yeah. And just even rewatching and re-listening to those, I think he's only one of, 15 people in history to play it all in one sitting in a recording. So, which is saying something, especially at 18 years old doing that. I mean, look, I've played some of the Transcendental Etudes, but I've never played it all in one setting. And it's already difficult enough when you're playing, Wilde Jagd, or if I'm pronouncing it correctly. I mean, I've never actually had a proper way of pronouncing it. But I mean, like, pieces like that on its own is already difficult enough. But all of them in rapid succession, in immediate succession, at one of the world's largest piano competitions is, well, I mean, virtuosic. Literally, that's virtuosity right there.
Yeah, absolutely. It's hard to even imagine that kind of pressure. But you mentioned the Wilde Jagd etude, which is the wild chase.
Yes.
Oh gosh, I do remember the period of when I was an undergrad student here in New York. I was studying with Jerome Rose, and I remember having a really hard time with this etude because it is extremely muscly. It's got these big chords that you just keep, repeating and playing ba-dum, 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 right? So to sort of emulate the feel of a wild chase, right? And at some point I said to my teacher, I have my whole body is hurting. I don't think I can play this. I think I should learn a different etude. And he said to me, you started it, you're going to finish it, and you are going to master this piece, which was such a great lesson for me. He said, you need to be like an actor who is given this role, and even if it doesn't fit with who you are going to deliver the best performance of that role that possible. And yes, I did it. After I was done with the performance, I said, okay, this is the last time I'm ever playing the piece. But it was a fantastic lesson in perseverance. Now, of course, I don't have that kind of supervision, so I get to choose not to play this etude because I simply think that I wouldn't play it well enough. I mean, when you have people like Yunchan at his tender age already playing it like a young god, why would I? What do I have to say? I think that's a question that we all must ask ourselves. Why am I learning this piece? What do I want to say through it? And I just don't think that I would ever have enough to as much to say as Yunchan did at the Clyburn competition.
Yeah. And it's fascinating to hear Yunchan's playing and also compared with earlier ones like Pogorelic's playing of the same piece. Very different approach, but still conveys the wild chase very, very well. If anything, I would even say with Pogorelic, it's almost like a primal chase even. There are parts where it's just like, wow, it's just almost like a berserker, basically. Just going. It's one straight line too. Yunchan has a lot more gracefulness to his chase, but it's still wild, but it's graceful at certain points. But Pogorelic is just, no, I'm going. I'm chasing after you. I don't care what I'm going to do. I'm going to be crashing into every building. No, I'm going after you.
Yes, my goodness. And Pogorelic does have a way of making the piano repertoire sound kind of terrifying almost, right? You know, the way he plays Gaspard de la Nuit, for example, by Ravel, right? It just scares the living life out of you. The sounds that he's producing, you know, that repertoire all of a sudden sounds incredibly dark and sinister. And I think that's the beauty of it, right? You can hear the same piece played by various pianists, and it sounds completely cliche, but it's every time a totally new experience. Yeah.
Yes, and the Canadian Chopin Competition and, well, eventually the International Chopin Competition will be great examples of that, because you get to hear it in rapid succession, some of the exact same pieces, especially in the final rounds when you hear the Polonaise Fantasy in A flat major and one of the two concertos. You're going to hear it. You're going to hear all these different performances, and and the nuances between them. And this is something that I also had a conversation with Jane Coop on a previous episode. And she said that, interestingly enough, the Polonaise Fantasy in A flat major had a lot more musically to say than even the concerti, which is fascinating.
Yes, it's an incredibly complex piece that really tests your maturity and your musicality, right? Your ability to tell a story, right? To narrate. And yes, it's much more of a fantasy than it is a Polonaise, right? And yeah, so it was incredibly revealing to hear the young pianists play that. And, you know, as jury members, we would get asked by, audience, how do you guys, how are you able to evaluate, these concerti? Are you hearing one after another, and there are only two concerti, and most contestants played the first, right, E minor. And how can you hear the same concerto, time after time, and how do you evaluate this? But that was the real beauty and really the testament to the high level of this competition, that each interpretation brought an entire new universe and kind of world of sound, world of aesthetic, world of rhetoric. And so those young musicians were really expressing who they are and what they've learned through that interpretation. And the beautiful thing is that it was maybe one of the first few times that they have done it, and they have a lifetime, right, to continue and to grow with those pieces.
Yeah. I mean, the top three winners are age 17, 22, and 22. So they plenty of stuff, and two of them haven't even graduated. Well, one of them sort of graduated, but they're on track to graduating from either a secondary school diploma or a university degree. So plenty of time for them to really grow into themselves, and especially with them competing in the prelims of the International Chopin Competition later on in April, you'll definitely see it, along with over 100 other also highly skilled, highly talented pianists there. It's going to be a joy to see, and I think that's why classical music is known for being deep. You don't see it immediately, but when you really dig deeper, the more you listen, it's the gift that keeps on giving. When you hear it. Yeah. Yes,
you said it, and I'm sure that their interpretations will already be different by the time they show up in Warsaw than they were, back in Toronto. They will have lived with it that much longer, right, and have had more experiences, maybe seen a painting that inspired them somewhere. So that's also the beauty of playing great music, that you have it for life, and you can never really say, I got this, right? This is how I'm always going to play this. This is my interpretation. No, the beauty of it is you find yourself, right? As they say, you never step into the same river, right? You are a different person tomorrow, right? And so that great music is going to find you, whoever you become tomorrow and in a year, and you're going to find the new you through that great music. And that's really an incredibly important thing to keep in mind, that it grows with you and it helps you also explore and push yourself, push to that new person you're becoming.
Yeah.
So one could never really, the moment you say, oh, I've got this piece, I know it, I got it, that's the wrong turn.
Yeah. And speaking about finding oneself as a musician and developing that, being the director of the music performance program at Columbia University and also the Columbia-Juilliard performance program, you have the educational aspect of that. You also have the task of facilitating and curating these opportunities for growth. How has this experience as an educator influenced your own piano performance? And what are your tasks, essentially? I mean, if you were to summarize it, what are your main tasks when it comes to curating, cultivating, and encouraging this sort of musical evolution?
Oh, wow, that's a beautiful and very kind of multi-layered question. Also, first of all, the joy of having these people in my life, or being in their lives rather, is just unlimited. You mentioned a gift that keeps on giving. This is really just being around these people who really give you hope for the future, because you're realizing these are our future, leaders and doctors and our lawyers, and the future is bright if they are the ones, around. A lot of the students I work with are actually have already decided that their careers will not be in performing music, but they do it on the highest possible level. And yes, to the point where some of them are actually attending both schools, Juilliard and Columbia, having gotten into each separately. So yeah, you can't really think of a more special kind of a crowd. We just recently had a concert which was truly life-changing. The way these people find in their heart the kind of maturity, in playing works by Schubert, for example. It's really something that I continue trying to understand. But, bottom line is I sometimes come home and I tell my husband, I think I have to quit my job because they already know everything. What can I offer them? Sometimes I just feel that just by being there and helping them provide the structure, the learning structure and the opportunities is really all they need, because they are able to make sense of what they do in a larger context, being, pre-med majors and, maybe pre-law or, goodness knows what. They come from these various backgrounds that are incredibly knowledgeable and eloquent, and they have these lives that I have no idea about. Once you see them in a recital and you realize that there is a whole, biochem crowd who comes into the concerts, and you realize, oh, you only know a small part of who they are, right? The musician that they are. But in fact, maybe they're Eastern, East Asian studies majors, and all of a sudden you're realizing there's such a kind of multi-layered personality and kind of relationship that you're seeing. But how it affects my own playing, it's incredibly humbling, right? To see how much at this tender age they have already accomplished. And it really has to be said that if you're working on a piece with someone, somebody will play it in a way you have never thought of. For example, I just had a student last Wednesday in my performance seminar. She's actually a PhD student, and she's a scientist. And she was playing La Barque sur l'Océan by Ravel from Miroir, and she talked about how the piece feels primarily rhythmic to her, and that's how, and that explained her interpretation. And I thought, goodness, I would have never thought that in my entire life, that this piece, which to me is all about timbre and gestures, right, and the colors that you produce on the piano, these kind of waves of that make you really imagine a small tiny boat on the ocean, the priority could be attached to the rhythmic aspects of it. And so that lit a light bulb in my head, and now I'm thinking of this piece in a totally different way. It added this whole layer of understanding the piece, and I would have literally never thought of that.
Yeah, and it's always intriguing to have a different perspective into music, a non-musical perspective into music. So back when I was still in law school, one of my professors, actually one of my constitutional law professors, his name is Joseph Magnet. And for those in the audience who are lawyers, Canadian lawyers in particular, you may recognize his name. He is a pretty well-known constitutional lawyer in Canada, has been on many of Canada's very prominent Supreme Court of Canada cases that have defined a lot of how interpretation of the Constitution and also different parts of constitutional law have come through. So Joseph Magnet is his name. He was talking to me back in law school how he mentioned that with his students that were musically trained, whether they're current law students or lawyers at that point, he said that there's a way how they look at a case that's very different from a non-musically trained person. So I asked him, in what way exactly? And he said, well, put it this way. You're looking at it almost like a sonata almost, right? You have this certain form, you have this certain way. And now he isn't, he just started playing the viola, I think, at the time, this would have been 2019, 2020. So, much later in life. So he said that, yeah, although I didn't really grow up playing a lot of instruments, I'm starting to see how you can interpret some sort of organization out of chaos, basically. Now, in the legal case, you have all these different facts, all these different factors, all the evidence, and the evidence can support or go against your case. But the way how you interpret it, the way how you go about trying to fit into your case, in law, we have something called the theory and the theme of the case, especially in litigation. That's what we do. When you're able to fit into that, then you're able to turn to use evidence, even if it is not necessarily in your favor. You can still kind of spin it in a way. It's like, hold on a second, it's not all against me. It's some of it still turns on against the other side as well, right? So, and he said that interpretation, you see this in musicians because interpretation is their middle name. It's within their performance. And when he mentioned that, I was thinking, oh, it opened my mind also to that area too, because I didn't think of that. Because for me, I was like, oh, I thought every law student would have thought that way. No, actually, it's like, oh, interesting. And that's what actually led me to write a paper on one of our former Supreme Court justices. And I won't get into much detail because that's going to go into a whole different discussion. But essentially, one of our Supreme Court justices was also a pianist before she became a lawyer and then became one of Canada's most prominent Supreme Court justices. I argue that her musical performance, her pianism, influenced her judgment writing, because if you look at her judgment writing, you see rondo form, you see sonata form, you see ternary form, you see all these different classical musical forms that we learn in music theory and harmony and counterpoint. You see that there. So I'm rambling a lot on this point, but I think this is also a good example of, I think, why a number of people who are musicians also go into law. I think it's that kind of very interesting kind of connection and intersection with interpretation.
Yes, yes. So, oh, this is brilliantly said, Amos. Yes, because what we are always thinking of is what happens between the notes, right? How do you go from one note to another? Are you going to all of a sudden see a three-dimensional picture come out of that really black page? All of a sudden it becomes a texture that has a foreground, a background, and so on. And yes, sort of reading between the lines is really. I mean, I could not begin to even understand what the amount of what you guys do in that respect. And thank goodness for great lawyers. But yes, it's reading between the lines, reading between the notes, and the variety of interpretations that are possible. That you're right. Maybe non-musicians never venture to think about. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's also one form of musicality. And as we head into a more detailed discussion about the road to Warsaw, this is a question that I always ask every single musician, because it may seem simple, but everyone has a slightly different answer or totally different answer to it. And it's essentially the question of musicality. So and I think we started talking about this question, what is musicality to you? I think we are starting to see what, between the notes are, right? What musicality is with that gap, right? So I think in your experience, you would have very much had that as a starting point, or one of the starting points or foundational points of what defines musicality for you.
So true, yes, and I would be so curious to hear a compilation of these various answers that you have heard. But yes, well, there's a song. It don't mean a thing if you ain't got that swing, right? And it's that swing. That Wynton Marsalis, who's not only an amazing performer, both in the jazz and classical fields, but also an important educator. He always talks about the importance of swinging, and I think that's really into the classical area. It translates again into how are you going to go from that first to the second note? How are you going to shape that phrase? How is it going to affect the larger picture, right? And do you have the music living in you? If you have a melody, of a Christmas carol, like right? Are you going to just see the notes on the page and go la 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 la, right? Or are you going to infuse it with the joy, with the context, right? With the kind of bounciness, right? That cannot really be fully notated, right? And that's where it goes back to our discussion of law and interpreting the text, right? How many various ways can you think of to go from the one note to the next in the context of what's happening? So there's a lot of kind of micro and macro processing the entire time we look at the piece of music, right? Yeah. So yeah, the musicality, and I wonder, can musicality be taught, or is this something that you simply have or don't, right? I know that in oboe instruction, and I've never played an oboe, but I understand that some teachers teach by numbers how to shape a phrase, for example, and they will say, okay, this is 6, 7, 5 for 3, and then up to 8, and they will actually assign a number to each pitch so that you can better understand the intensity with which to play. Does it translate into a kind of authentic experience? That's another question. But musicality is that kind of what they describe as the je ne sais quoi kind of music, right?
Yeah, and it requires a lot of introspection and a lot of reflection on oneself and also on the music. This is very much mandatory for any repertoire that you're playing or performing. I think for those in the audience who are not necessarily as immersed into the musical world, I think one analogy that could be explained would be, especially in a hockey game, for example, you have all these different players. Now, to an average person, they're just passing the puck around, and eventually they try to shoot onto goal. But why don't you just shoot it immediately? No. You have to outplay the other 5 players that are on the ice, right? You have to be able to outplay their defense. You have to be able to outskate them, outmaneuver them. and also be accurate with your shots as well. And many hockey fans, very hardcore hockey fans, especially those who are former hockey players, would say they can look at a player and say, oh, for example, Wayne Gretzky plays very differently from Mark Messier, or Sidney Crosby plays very differently from Alex Ovechkin, who also plays very differently from Connor McDavid. You know, they can look at all these players and say, oh, they have their own style of playing hockey, and they have their own style of interacting with different teammates, and especially with different positions on the ice. That's how they win plays. That's how they win points. That's how they win games. So I think that's sort of a close, I mean, not a perfect analogy, but a close enough analogy, in my opinion, to what musicians go through, right? I can tell Xiang Jinzhou plays the 24 Preludes very differently from Eric Guo, right? And also their instruments may be a bit different too. The concert halls are all going to be different too as well. And even if they were in the same hall, same piano, it's still different because they played this phrase a certain way, they rounded it this way, or they may play it in a very much more jagged way. You know, and that's, I'm just trying to say it from as simplified as possible for our audience. I think that's, yeah, I'm rambling again on this point, but I think that's one way of explaining musicality in a non-musical way.
Yes, musicality, personal style. Yes, as you know, as I mentioned before, it was just so wonderful to hear in the Chopin competition that one and the same piano, often same pieces, one after the next, and sounding so very different under the various, fingers of the various pianists. So yes, the kind of understanding, and you mentioned something really important, which is the kind of self-exploration and soul searching that one does. And again, we're so lucky to be able to do that, right? It's somebody said to me once, I guess it's, when you practice, it's a little bit like meditation. I said, well, what do you mean? It's hard work. Here I am getting my repetitive stress injuries right now. And she said, well, but it's sort of working on yourself, on becoming a better version of yourself. I thought, oh, okay, that's what and it immediately clicked, yes. And we are really fortunate to be able to spend so much time on perfecting something, and as a result, kind of digging deeper into our personalities, into who we are. It's really a luxury, right? And so I always think of it, and I remind this to my students who may experience performance anxiety. I just tell them, just think about how lucky you are to have this in your life, to be able to elevate, our spirits to this place, right? That share with us who you are and what you have learned by playing this piece.
Yes, totally agree. And about introspection and reflection, Fryderyk Chopin embodies so much of that in his music and in his life. In your opinion, why is Chopin's music so profound to people around the world?
This is a beautiful question, and yes, it's right. We love to claim him as a Polish composer, right? But even if you have never heard a word of Polish, you are going to understand, the language of Chopin. And maybe I don't claim to have the perfect answer for this, and I'm sure that again you would hear many different answers. But the fact that we are all, feeling human beings. And we have experienced a variety of emotions, right? From love to sadness, jealousy, grief, yearning, longing, all kind of, and that these emotions are ours. And Chopin is able to dig right into the core of those through his very simple tunes, right? And they are exquisitely crafted. There's no question, right? That the music is not just simple. He shoots straight for our hearts with these melodies that are hummable, that, kind of stick in your memory. The craft is completely out of this world, and the deeper one gets into this music. And that's a beautiful thing about aging with this great music, because you're just starting to see further and further into the score, all these layers of sophistication, right, of complexity. But down below, it's really just the simple human emotions, right? And it's also just such a spirit of romanticism, right? That this constant longing and the melancholia, right? These kinds of the nostalgic feelings, sometimes not even knowing what you are nostalgic for, what you are mourning, maybe even. So much of the romantic literature and painting is based on that very feeling. And I think it gives all of us in this mad rush of the 21st century, no matter where we are, that moment to realize that we have a soul and those emotions are there, and we may not have time on a daily basis to acknowledge them, but then there's Chopin, and he says it all.
Yeah, he truly says it all in so many different ways that we can't even count, musically and also just historically as well. For you, though, who is Chopin to you? Because not only do you relate to him on a musical perspective, but you also have that cultural connection as well. So who is he to you?
There was a short time when I came to the United States. I very quickly, I met Professor Jerome Rose when I was 15 in Warsaw. I went to a master class, and I met him there. This is before you could Google people. And so I had no idea who he was, but we had a fantastic working relationship. And then that's when he asked, how would you like to audition for Mannes College and to come and study in New York? I thought it was a wild idea, but long story short, there I was 2 years later auditioning. And that really was the life-changing moment, because I went, it meant that my adult life will take place in a different country, a different culture, and so on. And there was a time where, I was very brave overall, but there was a time when I heard the music of Chopin, I had to walk away, because it, just like Chopin, who left, his home early on. Of course, he left under different circumstances. There was an invasion and so on, but I could not bear, to have these emotions. Otherwise, I would have probably broken down and had to, maybe have had to go home. So that's how strong the yearning, the nostalgia was, the kind of the homesickness, and his music reminded me of that. So I had to walk away. I couldn't play Chopin for a little while. But he is also, as I keep discovering him as a musician, as a personality, I'm also seeing somebody who is an expat, kind of like me. I have now spent a larger part of my life here in the US than I did in Poland. And he is, very comfortable in Paris. He is now a member of a society. He has friends. He has completely assimilated to the French culture. And yet he continues, communicating his heritage and the pride of his, national identity. I think it's, they very often when you hear people who, let's say, are receiving an award, they always say, well, I always remember where I came from. And I find that so interesting that it reappears in so many speeches and statements. Always remember where you came from. And I think that was also a large part of what Chopin was doing. He was a really good Frenchman, and he was great at it too. But there he was writing this music that was so exquisitely Polish. And what interest would have the Parisians had in the melodies of mazurka, right? He's also smuggling political statements. He kind of cries for help, trying to raise awareness, but in the most elegant way possible, right? Always so classy, so composed, and under that three-piece suit, and his white gloves that he loves so much, and perfectly coiffed, hair, there was this entire storm of emotion, right? Very, very deep, spirit that was hurting, right? And I think that as a human being, we connect with that. Again, I'm just going back sort of to your previous question in that it's very universal, right? That we are a certain way when we go to work, right? We cannot get overly emotional all the time, right? It would not be acceptable. But what we have this rich inner life, hopefully, that Chopin certainly communicates. I think maybe what I'm focusing on more and more is the elegance with which he does that, the style, the class, those ornaments that are always going to be melodic. There's never any fluff that he writes. You would never find a tremolo, for example, written by Chopin. He never wastes a note on effects, so to say, right? And so what I really admire and I focus on is this unbelievable elegance and craft that is always present in his work. So so there's a lot of layers. There's the expat, and there's the inner life, and there's the that quality that I think we all strive to achieve when we work on something, right? To do it as well as we can, not to settle for the comfort, right? You wouldn't be a musician, right, if you wanted to settle for less and be comfortable, right? It's constant soul searching. And so I think that the music of Chopin, and even if it's a 2-page mazurka, it's really is such a reminder of that.
Yeah, that's such a beautiful answer, because although I'm not Polish, as a pianist myself, I relate to the yearning, the longing, the deep emotional spectrum that Chopin expresses through each and every single composition that he's written throughout his entire life. And I think that's also one of the challenges for us as musicians as well, because we have this we have the privilege of exploring a deep emotional spectrum that musical training offers us that many other different areas don't really do so. And especially if you are a fan of the Romantic eras, capital R, Romantic, such as Chopin and Liszt, but I mean Chopin being the focus of this episode, it's very difficult when it seems like you're the one who's expressing it, but to those around you, maybe not necessarily are able to kind of connect it as well as you do, or may not necessarily have the same experience with it. And sometimes it feels a little lonely too, right? And that, well, interestingly enough, comes back to Chopin. I mean, being away in a different country because of war and an invasion, that longing of home, that homesickness, that sort of thing, that sense of community, basically. I think that's what is, especially nowadays, and with the loneliness epidemic, actually, and this is something that's more real life current world issues right now. With the loneliness epidemic that's hitting the world, I think that longing, that sense, I think that's also why people have turned back to art in many different ways. And Chopin being an example of the many examples, I think that it's that yearning for some kind of expression, some emotional outlet, so to speak, that daily life in the 21st century, especially in a Western democracy, or even for non-Western industrialized countries, it's very difficult to find otherwise.
So true. And, homesickness, the idea of home, home is where the heart is, right? They say. And so if so many people are not close to that home, right? Not close to their emotions, not really in touch. And every now and then you'll see in a Chopin performance, people just weeping, and there are videos upon videos of it, from the Chopin competition in Warsaw, where the camera will pan on somebody who is drowning in tears all of a sudden, and it's the power of music that unleashes these emotions that we may be holding sometimes for years, right? And are not willing to admit to having. But yes, again, Chopin will break that lock, and he reminds us that we have a heart and that we are, feeling human beings.
And that reminds me of a couple things. First of all, this is going back to when I was still in high school and I was giving one of my performances back then. And there were a number of other repertoire, of course, but one of the pieces that I performed was one of Chopin's nocturnes. And I remember that in my performance of that nocturne, I invited a lot of my friends, my colleagues, and also my teachers at the time as well. I remember my politics teacher, and she told me this after. I think it was her or my math teacher told me this afterwards. They said, Amos, at some point, your politics teacher just started crying. I'm just like, oh, wow, really? And that was, again, one of Chopin's nocturnes. I was like, wow, I didn't realize it had that much thing. And I rewatched that video of myself playing that nocturne. At that point, I recognized a couple sniffles. And I'm like, yeah, that sounds like my politics teacher right there. I was just like, I think it was at that moment. I remember it. And I was like, wow, that was the first of many examples of how powerful Chopin's music was. And this was 17/18-year-old me back then, right? And then fast forwarding to this year at the Canadian Chopin Competition, I myself have shed many tears over some of the finalist performances as well. And for me, it was like, and this is me, like, I mean, you've heard these pieces thousands of times. I've heard these maybe like a couple hundred times or whatnot, and I've played some of these pieces, but even for me, I'm like, wow, like it's no matter how many times you hear it, no matter how many times you played it, when you hear it differently, it hits you so well. It just hits it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. Yes.
Straight to the heart.
Yes, and you're right. And probably the moments when you shed the tear was when the performers were really giving their all. They were not sheltering themselves and not trying to be tough because it's a competition. I have to stay, thick-skinned and remember, make sure not to have a memory slip or so. It's that very special and rare moment where a performer becomes completely vulnerable and allows performers allow themselves to for the audience to get to them. I don't want to say naked because that may have negative connotations of kind of shame, but you are completely exposed with your entire heart to those strangers, and that's when the magic happens, when you unleash yourself and you allow yourself to be vulnerable and fragile, right? Because that's where the depth of our emotions come from, and it's not easy to do, right? Especially under the pressure of competition and knowing that you're getting a numeric score for your playing, for goodness sake. But yeah, those and sometimes these moments just happen for a few seconds in the performance, and I've experienced them both as a listener and have been fortunate enough to experience them also as a player, when everything is just right. They're listening, you can feel the silence in the hall, and that's when you realize you can let go. And that's where people come with tears in their eyes after the concert, right? So it's a totally universal language, and you're right that during the loneliness epidemic, I think this speaks even more strongly to our hearts. And lucky are those who have found music, as that outlet.
Yeah, totally agree. And having seen that at the competition firsthand, and to be honest, for me, it was also difficult to step back on stage too, because I'm like, I gotta wipe my tears away before I step on a stage with puffy eyes and whatnot. It was, yeah, but it's, yeah, and and that's also one of the reasons why I wanted to have this mini series on my podcast. This is the Legend of, because this is something that is not often talked about in the mainstream. I mean, even if you're outside of Canada or the US, in general, not many places around the world talk about that part of themselves, because this is what defines a human. That's what separates a human from really much of the non-anthropic experience. It's that ability to be one with yourself. I think being one with the music, in a way, is also being one with oneself. And some of the most profound performances, as you mentioned, Magdalena, are those who really fully open themselves up. And I remember one video recording of Vladimir Horowitz. I forgot what piece he was playing, but I remember that the title of that YouTube video was basically Horowitz himself was crying as he was playing the piece. And it just so happened that he was looking straight into the camera as well. It's like, wow, that is profound. And people also in the audience, even after he finished playing that piece, there was probably about 2 or 3 seconds of complete silence before anybody even applauded, because they were also very emotional about that performance. And that's why these are moments that are often missed in the hustle and bustle of today's world. I mean, you living in New York, I mean, you're right by Wall Street, right? That's the name of the game. You have to be basically machinistic, basically a full machine going into a place like that, right? And Toronto having its own mini Wall Street, aka Bay Street here, similar deal here. So it's so important, and that's why whenever I see musicians, especially those who are no longer performing full time but are in different areas of work, it's always refreshing to see it, because there's still that aspect of humanity that they can always come back to when things get really difficult.
Right. And it's so direct, right? I mean, there's art, you can glance at a painting and walk away, right? But with music, it sort of pins you down. I'm actually thinking of that of Marina Abramovic, who is a performance artist, right? Who did a series of a series at MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art, called The Artist is Present. And what it was that the artist herself was sitting on a chair and looking into the eyes of whoever chose to sit with her for as long or as short as and talk about an amazing document of emotions. It's available on YouTube for anyone to see. People would just break down, and there were so many instances in which tears were shed, and there were no words that were exchanged, but it's really just that moment of having to be with yourself, maybe focusing for once, not thinking about a million things, not looking at your phone, just focusing. That elicited such incredibly strong emotions. I think music certainly has a way of doing that, and I think maybe that's kind of one of the misconceptions that classical concert goers may feel, that sometimes the applause, as you mentioned, will come later, or it may feel a bit muted. But it doesn't mean that the performance was not strong. Maybe it actually means the opposite, right? That the audience was so moved that they forgot themselves. And it's the purpose of this sharing experience is not for the recital hall to sound like a football stadium all of a sudden, right? Although everybody likes saying good applause, but it's a compliment, I should say, when you hear that silence and you realize, oh, they were really listening. They understood, right? And the applause comes and it's muted, and that's when the mission is accomplished. And so for anyone who may be a first-time concert goer, it could be a bit off-putting, but that's when the magic really happens.
Yeah, exactly. Because it's not all just noise and yelling and screaming at the top of your lungs sort of events. Classical music events are not like that. It's all in here. right? The way how I describe the contrast between sports and music is that sports is all in here, whereas music is all in here. I mean, for those who are listening on to the audio version, sports is like, oh, it's all in the arms and the legs, whereas music is all in the mind, right? So it's it requires such a deep, and that's the reason why, especially for those who don't have that exposure to music, for them, they've never really had a chance to explore it to that extent in their personal time because they focus on other aspects of their humanity. So to be faced with that for the first time, or even for if it's just the first few times, it may be difficult at first, but it hits them so well. It hits them so hard that it leaves a very strong impression on them, sometimes for even months. You know, that one concert could be like, wow, a couple months later, and I still hear those tunes in the back of my head, even when I'm at work.
That's right. And that's how, as you said, that's kind of what distinguishes us as humans, right? That ability to communicate on that highly emotional level, right? And so you said, yes, music is a kind of experience of the mind, but this whole time we've been talking, it's not to say that it's a pure intellectual experience, right? It's deeply, deeply emotional and very direct often, right? Especially with the music of Chopin.
Yeah. And his tackling of the Polonaise itself. And for me, in my spare time, I dug a little deeper into actually the Polonaise, the history of the Polonaise itself, and its very unique rhythmic structure. It's really fascinating to see how Chopin was able to just expand it across so many different ways, and also in ways that are, I want to say unrecognizable, but almost unrecognizable, but still you hear that rhythm. Like you hear it, and then especially the Polonaise Fantasy in A-flat major, but really all of his Polonaises, it's you really see just the mastery of that. And I mean, even with so-called modern Polonaises, I mean, there's one you probably know this movie. It's a film adaptation of a Polish story. Please correct my pronunciation of it. It's Pantaduz, I think, is the
Pantaduz.
Yes, yeah. And I heard that Polonaise. I'm just like, wow. And it was composed in 1999 or in the 90s. I'm thinking, wow, so similar. It's just like you still hear it, and it's modern too.
Yes, it's that last scene, yes, where they all dance, and yes, it ends on such a high note of being proud of who you are, where you are from, and I think that's something important also to remember in a world where we very often belong to multiple places, right? Sometimes we wonder, do we actually belong to any of them? And this is again a lovely reminder of one's identity. It sometimes takes work, right, to figure out who you are, what your identity is, especially for somebody who is alive during Chopin's time, where Poland was essentially wiped out of the map of Europe until 1918. So there were Poles, but there was no Poland, right? So you have to work that much harder. So the expression of Polonaise is that much more meaningful and poignant here, right? Because the country doesn't exist, but we exist, right? And so there we could be talking all night about this, but again, digging into who we are, I think, is something that's often missing, and we love these ideas of boot camps and yoga this and it's all wonderful to do, but music does that for you, and it's just also so beautiful. So for anyone out there who has not had that experience, I would urge you to do yourself a favor and find yourself through music, and you will not come out disappointed.
Totally agree. And this is also a good opportunity for those of you in the audience who are still watching at this point or listening at this point. Be sure to check out the Canadian Chopin Competition on the Canadian Chopin Society's YouTube channel if you want to see those performances. And by the time this episode gets released, the prelims would have already started, so be sure to tune in to the Chopin Institute's YouTube channel for the preliminaries of the International Chopin Competition. This is a perfect opportunity for you to see just how deep the rabbit hole goes, just how deep the musical performance of the same but immortalized pieces could really go with this, with the incredible life and, well, man that is Fryderyk Chopin. As we start to close this episode, in your career, from your experiences across education, performance, life of Chopin, judging all these different competitions, what are the most rewarding things about your career? And what are the most important lessons that you've learned that you would want to pass on to our audience today?
Oh, goodness. That's fantastic. You have all these fantastic questions. Just feeling privileged to be a part of an experience, a deeply human experience, and it doesn't necessarily mean that that every performance you're going to hear must be perfect. I actually learned that by attending multiple performances of the same opera, right? The operas are so long, and so inevitably some moments are going to be better than others. Maybe a singer is going to have a better day on one day and then maybe not so great on the next day. And you realize that maybe your perfect performance that you have built in your mind may exist over multiple showings, right? And so I suppose it has taught me not to be upset when I hear a performance that may not be mind-blowing in its perfection, because there's always something to discover, something to learn, and something to be humbled by. And just the fact that there's a human being, offering you a piece of who they are and this very hard work that they have put into sharing this, it's a total privilege, and maybe that has been the greatest reward, just be a part of humanity, our shared humanity.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great way to end this episode on. Magdalena, it's been great to have you on the show. You're welcome back at any point in time in the future. And I think our audience has learned a lot from your experience and also from Chopin's experience as well. And it's always good to talk with you. And it's great that you have shared, well, the living legend of Magdalena Baczewska.
Thank you so much, Amos. I loved our conversations. Really appreciate it. Thanks.
And thank you to our audience for tuning in to this episode. You have just heard or seen the living legend of Magdalena Baczewska. You can follow her on Instagram at MagUchanNYC. Let me spell it out for you. MagUchanNYC. That's her Instagram handle. I'll also leave a link to that in the description of the episode if you want to pay attention to her adventures in music and abroad as well. And also, again, a reminder to our audience that be sure to check out the Canadian Chopin Society's YouTube channel for the Canadian Chopin Competition, as well as the Chopin Institute in Poland. The Chopin Institute's YouTube channel for the International Chopin Competition preliminaries in April, as well as the main competition for the entirety of the month of October 2025. So be sure to tune into those. You certainly do not want to miss the world's best performances of Fryderyk Chopin's music. And also be sure to follow us on our social media as well at This Is the Legend Of. You can follow us on Instagram and also on LinkedIn, as well as follow us on your different podcasts platforms, wherever you get them, as well as be sure to like the video, sforzando the like button, I should say. Subscribe to the YouTube channel and click the bell notification icon so you'll always be up to date whenever we upload. Once again, signing off for this episode, this is Amos Vang. Thank you so much for tuning in. Stay safe, stay healthy, and stay legendary.